Welcome everyone to our Decarb Lunch here in September, first one after the summer break. Just want to take a minute or so, give some folks to come in after a busy morning, I'm sure, and then we'll get started in about a minute here. Okay, for the purposes of time, and we just have a great topic to discuss today, I'm going to get things kicked off. So hello and welcome to the first Decarb Lunch after a summer webinar break. My name is Natalie Douglas, and I'm the program manager of ZEBx. Today, we're here with SES Consulting and KingSett Capital about how one can create a strong business case for building decarbonization. To demonstrate a business case in action, they'll chat about a current commercial building retrofit project of theirs from downtown Vancouver. And now, just to start things off in a good way, I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm joining here today from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and also to give thanks for the financial support from Van City, the City of Vancouver, BC Hydro, and NRCan that allows us to afford to offer these webinars for free. If you're interested in getting continuing education credits for attending today, please see the information that my colleague Carrie is going to drop into the chat. As always, please use the chat for commenting and posing questions for the presenters and others just joining this webinar. We'll try to use these questions to help guide discussion at the end of the hour. Now, just a reminder that ZEBx is part of a family of program areas nested within the federally endowed Zero Emissions Innovation Centre, otherwise known as ZEEC, the BC contingent of the FCM seed-funded Low Carbon Cities Network. So ZEBx can be understood as the main convener and amplifier of content developed by ZEEC's Building Decarbonization team. Do check out B2E for all things building electrification, BC Retrofit Accelerator for retrofits, Near Zero for research and incentives, and CLF-BC or Carbon Leadership Forum BC for embodied carbon matters. So if you're unsure about how to approach the world of building decarbonization or just want to be updated about absolutely everything, I see you, I am you, ZEBx should be your first point of contact. We compile and aim to synthesize content from all the specialist program areas to get into that juicy and very necessary discussions about the complex task of bringing all of these various priorities together. So it's also important to note that ZEEC is not just the Building Decarb team. We also have colleagues specializing in communications, economic transformation, granting, and we're all working towards decarbonization in our urban spaces. So while I am very honored to introduce my co-host. Carrie is first going to launch a poll just to get a sense for who's in the room. And I'll pass things over quickly to Jennifer Davis, the Director of the Decarb Accelerator Program at the Builder Owners and Managers Association of BC, otherwise known as BOMA, to kick things off today. So over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. BOMA BC is excited to be co-hosting this event today to advance discussions of decarbonization and showcase the efforts of KingSett Capital and SES Consulting on Arthur Erickson Place, really an iconic downtown Vancouver building. As Natalie mentioned, my name is Jennifer Davis. I'm here representing BOMA BC as the program director of their recently launched Decarb Accelerator initiative. A little bit about that. The Decarb Accelerator is a commercial buildings component of the BC Retrofit Accelerator initiative in partnership with ZEEC. Briefly, BOMA's objective with the Decarb Accelerator initiative is to provide hands-on support to over 75 large commercial buildings over the next 2.5 years. As together, we seek to identify and initiate deep carbon retrofits. BOMA's support through this initiative will come in the form of fully funded energy assessments, decarbonization roadmaps, feasibility studies, controls optimization, training and education for building site personnel, and a whole host of other customized solutions. We really encourage you to scan that QR code and learn more about the program offering and see if maybe your building or your client's building might be a good fit. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to pass it back to Natalie to introduce today's featured speakers.
Thanks, Jennifer, and for offering that helpful context and exciting programs. So just as I introduced Stephanie, I can stop sharing my screen, and so you can share yours. So we have two presenters today, Stephanie Poole, Principal at SES Consulting, and Kit Milnes, Vice President of Sustainability and Resilience at KingSett Capital, to share a lot of really great takeaways from this case study. So over to you, Stephanie. Thank you both.
Perfect. Can everyone see my screen? Excellent. My name is Stephanie. As Natalie said, I'm a principal with SES Consulting. I do all types of building decarbonization, from controls, mechanical design, commissioning, project management support, and I also have a background in teaching, so I tend to do a lot of our course development. We teach courses for the Canadian Institute of Energy Training, as well as BC Hydro, Fortis, and ZEBx, or I suppose ZEBx. I appreciated the little breakdown of all of the pieces. That was really nice, Natalie. Now I have a good vision. And I'll pass it over to Kit to introduce himself, and then we'll get kicked off.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kit Milnes from KingSett Capital. I'm our VP of Sustainability and Resilience, which essentially gives me a lot of control over our sustainability strategy, executing it across all of our functions. So that's asset management, development, lending as well. And myself and my coworker, Joe Brown, are responsible for developing and executing our decarbonization strategy across all of our funds and within our new developments. That includes the case study that we're going to be presenting today on Arthur Erickson Place, and kind of how we initiated the strategy, got the buy-in, and then moved forward to actually breaking ground and executing it.
Perfect. Thanks, Kit. Okay, so let's get started. Jennifer already hinted that this is Arthur Erickson Place, as you will find out shortly. But Kit and I decided we wanted to present this topic because there's so many topics on, case studies, all the technical details of how a building was decarbonized, but there's a lot less focus on the business case, and that's obviously the piece that you need to get the buy-in to move forward to actually do these projects. We teach a course through the Canadian Institute of Energy Training on this, and I'm always so surprised how many participants it continues to have. And everyone just has a really different, all the organizations have a different way that they build the business case and what they need to get the yes. So we're going to focus on KingSett because I would say they're one of our more advanced clients. They've been doing this a long time, and I think they have some really cool details for you. Okay, let's get started. So today we're going to talk a little bit, just kind of the basics of what we do to build an effective business case. Through the courses that we teach, through the studies that we develop for our clients, some of the things we've learned along the way. And then we're going to take that and we're going to make it specific for Arthur Erickson Place. What did SES and KingSett do to actually get the yes so that they could decarbonize this building? What were the steps? What was the order? All that kind of stuff. We're going to give you a quick update on where we are with that zero carbon plan, what stages we've done, what we have to do still, just, so you have an update. And then I've put a couple pages at the end for additional resources. Arthur Erickson Place actually got quite a bit of publicity. There's lots of articles written on it, so you can read a lot more because this won't go into all the details of the actual decarbonization plan. Kit, anything to add on there?
No, that sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk first about building an effective business case. There's tons I can talk about on building an effective business case. So I've broken it down into kind of 4 main components, and we're going to touch on this briefly because I have like 10 minutes. So for context, we teach an entire 2-day course on this. First of all, I think the important thing to note is that a bad decarbonization project is never going to have an effective business case. It doesn't matter what metrics you look like. It doesn't matter what considerations you include. It's not going to look good. And I'm going to talk about what kind of a good versus a bad decarb project looks like. And Kit's going to touch on that as well because they've got it dialed within KingSett. We're going to talk a little bit about the cost estimates. What kinds of things might you want to include in a life cycle costs analysis? What level of accuracy might you want to have for your decisions? That kind of thing. We're going to talk about the metrics. I think this is an interesting one just because Every organization has different metrics they like to look at, but there are some metrics that give a better picture of the holistic view of the project than others. And so I want to talk about that briefly. And then the last thing we're going to talk about a little bit, and Kit's going to touch on this mostly, is external funding sources. Obviously, if you can bring the money to the table, it's going to make the project a lot more attractive to your investors and your decision makers. Okay, so good versus bad decarb. I will let you read this in more detail because you will have access to the slides after this. But basically, a good decarb is not just taking your gas equipment and switching it to electrification, electrical equipment, right? It's not taking my boiler and like for like converting it to an electric boiler. That's not going to be a good decarb project. That's not going to have a good payback, and that's never going to get a yes. Typically, the bad decarbs are prohibitively expensive, which is what you would see if you tried to convert your gas directly to electric, right? So a good decarb is much more holistic. You're going to focus on the building, the holistic building. You're going to look at all the components, the controls, the envelope, where there's waste, where you can improve efficiency. Is the equipment right size? Does it need to be downsized? Making sure you're using the data that you have. So this good decarb, it's not just an electrification, it's what's called a deep energy retrofit. So overall, the building is not just electrified, it's actually more efficient, less wasteful, better operating, more comfortable. It's a much more holistic view. And typically, it's still more expensive than business as usual, but it shouldn't be drastically or prohibitively expensive. All right. Oh, life cycle cost analysis. So, what is happening? Apologies. There we go. Okay, there's like a mouse in my mouse. Great. So in terms of the life cycle cost analysis, again, every consultant is going to analyze this differently. Every building owner, operator is going to want to look at different metrics. But what's really important is looking at the life cycle, right? I don't want to look at just the capital cost because that doesn't give me a holistic view. I don't want to look at just the payback because I'm neglecting a lot of components in there. So typically what we recommend is, doing a life cycle cost analysis. And what you include in there and what you don't include in there is absolutely up to you. Kit will talk a little bit more about what KingSett does include, how they do that. But some of the things that you might want to consider are, carbon costs. I know that KingSett specifically, they include carbon costs, but only in some of the analysis, right? So they would look at different options, and that's pretty typical. You want to do a sensitivity analysis. What are going to be the pieces that are going to drive whether that's a good opportunity or a bad opportunity? And what if something changes? As I'm sure many of you know, the penalties for emissions limits for the City of Vancouver are coming in 2026. And if you are above the threshold, that will be billed at $350 per ton. So that's not yet in place, but it is coming. Definitely something to consider. I'll talk a little bit about the social cost of carbon. That's one of those ones that you could read articles and white papers, and everyone has a different opinion of what those numbers should be. But I do have a slide on where some good references might exist. I think a really important thing about a life cycle cost analysis here is that you're trying to look at all of the pieces. Have you done a feasibility analysis? Is the measure that you're recommending actually going to be able to be put on the roof, or can you fit it through the door? Is it going to require an electrical service upgrade or new wiring or new panels? Have you looked at maintenance costs or savings? Typically, and I know this is what we did for Arthur Erickson Place, you want a minimum of a level 2 study. In Arthur Erickson Place, we did a level 3 study. So we're looking at this. We have a pretty good idea of what the electrical costs are, what the maintenance savings are, where we're going to put it, how big it's going to be, how the wiring is going to be run. So we can actually get a relatively accurate cost, because if you're going to go to your decision makers and you're going to say it's $1 million and then it turns out to be 10 million, they are never going to let you do a decarb project ever again. So, and then we'll talk about iterating a little bit more, and Kit has a really good vision of this in KingSett of how they, they're never just done, right? They're using that data to inform the next one and update things. Really quickly here, because I will let you read this later, but this is an interesting table from Environment Canada, the Government of Canada, and it's kind of estimating what the social cost of carbon is over the next few years. And I know we have a lot of clients who like to develop an internal carbon cost. So if that is something you're interested in doing, this might be a good reference for you. But I won't dive into that too much in this course or in this presentation. Last one, before we get into the specifics of Arthur Erickson Place, which I know is what is the most interesting, is just your comparison metrics. So again, I mentioned, a payback, a simple payback. That's not a very good metric to give me a full understanding of the business case. You can use IRR, you can use net present value. That's pretty typical within the industry. But what we typically do is we present net present value per ton. And the reason I really like this is because it's basically saying, how much is it going to cost me per ton of emission savings, CO2 equivalent? And so it's really nice because now I can compare a boiler upgrade that saves 50 gigajoules to a full decarbonization project that saves 2,000 gigajoules, right? And I can kind of compare them apples to apples to see, per ton of savings, which one is more expensive. Or in some cases, which one saves you the most money. But I will say for decarb, it's not typically that you're going to save money when you do it. It's typically how much is it going to cost you. And this is what Kit's going to talk about on the next couple slides. And I really like this way to kind of present a really good business case and make it understood what it looks like, is comparing the business as usual. What is it going to look like if we continue with business as usual over 20 years as compared to our selected decarbonization bundle? So Kit has a really nice table and he'll show you because that's what KingSett does. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Kit to talk a little bit about Arthur Erickson Place.
Great. Stephanie, let's go to the next slide. So before we dig into Arthur Erickson, one more slide, because KingSett didn't start with Arthur Erickson to decarbonize. We had to really understand the world that we owned, how to scope it down, and come to the decision that Arthur Erickson needed to be decarbonized immediately versus, it could wait 10 years. So all of this stuff kind of gets defined company by company, standard by standard, country by country. We needed our own definition of what do we consider decarbonization. So we had to define that for ourselves, and we said 50% reduction from a baseline, and that'll be the minimum. And then under that kind of guidance, we said, okay, well, now we know what we're calling decarbonization, how do we choose a property to develop a decarbonization strategy for? And we realized that we need to have a number of prerequisites that buildings had to meet in order for us to even begin a strategy. Because if it didn't meet one of those prerequisites, it just wasn't ready. So as I go through these, you'll kind of understand why they're quite important and all need to be hit. Your major mechanical needs to be at or near end of life. You might fast track one or two pieces of equipment because it hasn't quite got there, but for the most part, you want to make sure that you're ripping out equipment that's already been first fully recovered, and second, you're not adding net new embodied carbon emissions, so it's already at end of life. That means that for the property, for the asset owner, you're going to need to be spending a lot of capital just to keep the doors open and lights on. Therefore, your decarb strategy isn't going to be justifying 100% of capital. It's only going to be justifying a premium from business as usual, keeping the lights on, the doors open, to doing full electrification and efficiency pursuit. The next is you have to have real-time data. You have to know what the building uses in real time for at least one heating and one cooling season. This is extremely important to control the capital side of what your decarb strategy will look like. We're no longer doing like-for-like replacements for equipment. So you really need to understand how your building lives and breathes, and knowing this different seasons is very crucial for that. The third is that the property needs to be able to handle the capital premium to do the decarb strategy, fuel switch and electrify. And what I mean by this is, if your margins are very tight or your amortization pool, what you're able to recover against your tenant is already at its maximum. Maybe you just finished a lobby reno, maybe you're doing elevator modernization. That means it's not going to be a good time to do a major decarb strategy for your building because you have no additional capacity to recover significant amounts of mechanical spend. That's either going to put you out of market against your peers in that neighborhood, or you as the owner are going to have to eat that capital and write it off. Finally, the property needs to be in a region that supports electrification. It'd be great if we could pursue where the carbon emissions are biggest, but if the electrical grid for that building is dirtier than the emissions associated with natural gas for heating, then it's probably not going to pencil out as a net carbon savings to try to do an electrification for that project. So these are 4 mandatory requirements that we have before we can move forward. And because Arthur Erickson hit all of them, we were able to take the next step. So why don't we do that, Steph? So we have the strategy. Now we can go and figure out, how do we get buy-in? How do we find the easiest win? And that starts with canvassing the portfolio. It's the easiest one, the one that requires the least amount of work. It doesn't matter if it's not displacing significant amounts of carbon. That's not the point of that easy win. The point is to get the buy-in from the executive team and the investor level to be able to say, we understand, we see the value. Now, why don't you go do this more? So that easy win is extremely important. Next is finding the good decarb opportunity. You set up the prerequisites so you can scope and create boundaries so that you aren't trying to focus everywhere and do everything all at once. You'll drown yourself in opportunities and also mistakes. We highly recommend being conservative when you approach decarbonization. Is there a green premium? There might be. We haven't seen anyone in the market saying, oh, you're a zero carbon space, we will pay an extra 20, 30% on top for rents, or on the other hand, it's asset value. We don't see an appraiser coming to us saying, because your building is decarbonized, we're going to add an evaluation boost that's built within our methodology. It could be there, it's coming in time, but because these things aren't established in the market, we're not going to try to hang our hat on them and say, decarb works because of these things that hopefully are going to come down the pipeline. Right sizing equipment. This is kind of the new normal that we see at KingSett. We're done the like-for-like replacement, the right sizing, using data to make sure you're controlling how much equipment you're putting in is absolutely crucial moving forward. And it's just good for the building. Like, carbon aside, this would be the right thing to do if you were just trying to get a building that's going to operate and be a high performer. And then if you can, wherever you can, find external financing. That covers where the capital is going to come from to execute these projects. And if you can get it at lower interest rates than what the existing line of debt for that building or for the fund is, that's going to be even better. And give yourself more buy-in from the executive and investor level. Let's go to the next slide. So that was the KingSett kind of strategy high level. Now we're going to dig into Arthur Erickson Place. It was built about 5 decades ago, so it's a decently old building. A lot of stuff is coming up for end of life for the first time, or is actually on its second or third turn for renewal. It's just under 400,000 square feet, so it's a large building. It's got some additional complexity because it's joint ventured with three partners: KingSett, Crestpoint, and Reliance. So that means you need to be really good at telling your story and why you want to spend more money for a building for capital renewal than what people are traditionally accustomed to. And you have to show the reason why. You have to show your work. That forces the strategy to stand up to scrutiny. That's actually a really good thing. You should invite scrutiny to all your decarb work you're trying to develop, because if someone can punch a hole in it very quickly, then it wasn't good decarb. Otherwise, for Arthur Erickson Place, it's a very traditional standard building. It's, gas and electricity for its energy makeup. It had gas-fired boilers, air handling units for heating and cooling, 2 chillers in the cooling towers. It was zone systems, induction units for cooling only. And we're in the process of kind of upgrading its controls from pneumatic to DDC, and having everything connected into its building automation system. The one other thing to note for this building is it was single pane windows. That didn't change. The facade, those never have a payback. So unless it's at point of failure, you're probably not looking at touching it unless there's a massive other value add for the asset.
And we'll talk about the selected strategy and what was considered on the next couple slides. So you can have more details about why we didn't touch the single pane windows.
Arthur Erickson met all of our 4 prerequisites. At that point, we had spent very little, probably no money on making sure it met those prerequisites. That's really important. You might, if you're starting from a different position, need to spend a bit of money on getting good data, so submetering the major mechanical systems. But when you're really scoping and trying to figure out, is this property a right candidate, even before you get an audit or a carbon study, you shouldn't have to spend money in order to do that kind of high-level desktop analysis. The next is we studied various opportunities. That would have been the audit or the decarb study that was done. That's highlighting kind of high-level opportunities, figuring out right sizing of the systems and controls in order to make sure that capital spend would come in at something that we would entertain. At that point, then we're putting together our design, construction, commissioning, external other consultants, whether you need an architect, things like that. Putting that team together, you want them together from the early stages, and you really want to find someone who's either going to be, the design construction team, or at least be at the table throughout the whole process. Commissioning is also really important to have at the table at the beginning, not just at the end. If you find that you've got a group that's not kind of on the same page as you, it's really helpful to get them out early and swap them in with someone else. Then once you're already at the end of design or beginning of construction. Find those capital sources, whether it's incentives, rebates, tax credits, loans, anything you can to start lowering the capital burden before you present to asset management and the investors, other partners. That just makes the overall package more appetizing from the investor level. And if you're jumping into loans or tax rebates, there's typically additional levels of scrutiny and third-party verification. So it provides the investor with that additional level of assurance that this is real and I'm going to see what I'm being told I'm going to see. After that, it's really, we're constantly modeling, even, 2-3 years after executing some of these projects, we're still modeling and learning about where our assumptions were, where they need to be, how we were wrong. So it's really important to continuously do that throughout the process.
Perfect. I just have a couple really quick things to add. I think, and as someone actually mentioned, what do you mean by canvas the portfolio? So what Kit is talking about is, meeting those prerequisites, the, end of life equipment, having the data, all of those things. We can go back to that slide if we need to. But I think what's really interesting to note here is they're not spending any money. They're not going through their whole portfolio. They're not doing level 1 or level 2 studies. And I think a lot of people, especially owners of large portfolios, can get stuck in this process. It's like, well, I need to do a level 1 study for all 50 buildings, or I need to do a level 2 study. And there are some incentives available for those, especially in BC. So, if you can get them done for free and you need to learn about your buildings, perhaps that's beneficial. But in most other provinces, those incentives don't exist. And so spending that time and money to do all of that is really prohibitive. I think the way that KingSett manages that and just be like, okay, well, it's end of life equipment. I can tell you without looking at anything that the best time to decarb is to do end of life equipment, right? So if you're using that high level data, to understand where your best opportunities are. And then you take that best opportunity and you dive in. You do a detailed study so that you are actually covering, the feasibility. Because the trick with a level 1 study, and I've seen this lots of times on a building, we get a level 1 study and it was like, oh, you should do this decarb. And it's like, oh, well, actually, I can't do that because I can't put that on the roof because it doesn't have the structural integrity. And so that whole measure is completely not valid because the level 1 study doesn't necessarily give you that data. So I really like what they do there. They do high level and then they get the detail with the intent to implement.
And I should just add to that, Canvas analyzed the portfolio, leaning on even old audits, BC building condition assessments, anything that's been done in the past that might have equipment age or year or install it. And that even means like going back to old budgets to see when something was budgeted and paid for. Just to give you an idea at no cost of what your system status would be for the buildings. That is because that's probably the most important prerequisite. That's the one we put a ton of effort on first.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. And I will just highlight, because this is something that we've written about in the commercial electrification guide, which is coming out in October, and you will have a ZEBx presentation on that, but the integrated design process, having a team that goes all the way through, right? Like Kit said, the person who's designing it is the person who's managing construction, the person who's commissioning it, and they're all collaborating and they all are invested in this process. And the efficiencies that are gained with that are huge, and that integrated design process is not used very much in retrofit projects. It is very readily used in new construction. And if you look at the guide when it comes out, there's a whole section on that. So I just wanted to highlight how important that is and how that has allowed KingSett to really achieve the results and actually hit their targets.
And unfortunately, that does mean we have a very small pool of consultants and companies that we use to execute these projects, because sometimes it does take a lot of convincing to get them to where we need them to be for the system size and the capital control to actually work at the end of the day and for the project to get greenlit. Okay, let's go to the next. So we put all the pieces for Arthur Erickson together. We did all the prerequisite work. We found the right team. We got a really good strategy developed. Now we need to understand what's the cost benefit analysis. It's so important that when you're presenting a decarbonization strategy to owners or asset managers, show them the what if situation, because everything is an opportunity cost. If I'm going to do business as usual, I'm not going to go do decarb. If I'm going to electrify, I'm moving away from business as usual. So how do these decisions compare against each other? And we had to spend a lot of time building this modeling tool. This is an excerpt from it that you're looking at right now, in order for us to understand, is decarb ever the right choice versus business as usual? Because we're going to be adding a capital premium to the new systems we're putting in. Do we ever see a payout, before the system's at end of life? And as we iterated this model, layering in different metrics, adjusting them over time, each building has, I think, over 6,000 data points. Everything is transparent and editable. So you can say, I believe electricity inflation is going to 12% for the next 10 years, or I think natural gas is going to stay extremely high because of, global volatility and new wars popping off. Like things like that are valuable metrics to be able to manipulate to see how your strategy is going to plan out. And we only started running into these issues when we would present a strategy to our asset management team. They'd say, oh yeah, but what if, fill in the blank. What if natural gas drops and it's no longer as expensive as it is? How does the model look? Well, we needed to figure that out. You need to figure it out over a very long timeline, because these systems are going to last for 20 years or more. We've really moved away from the 5-7 year payback on measures to, if this equipment's going to last for 20 years, show me a 20-year horizon. And how does that look? Does zero carbon ever become better than non-zero carbon? So these two lines here, I think, unfortunately, on the legend, it's Series 3 and Series 1. The gold is the zero carbon strategy. The gray is the non-zero carbon. So that's business as usual. Even though the zero carbon strategy has about 1.3 million of capital premium going into it to execute that project, the massive op cost savings we're getting from driving efficiency because of that capital premium that we wouldn't otherwise see if we were doing business as usual. And business as usual is boilers are up for replacement next year. Well, what is the size we're replacing? Do like for like. In 5 years after that, the chiller is going to be replaced. What size is the chiller? Let's do that. You get some efficiency boost just from having new technology versus 20-year-old technology. But when we've been doing decarbonization, everything gets done at once. That's another hurdle on the asset management perspective. You need all that capital at once versus spread out, but you're harmonizing all the systems and you're commissioning all the systems all together. And you're trying to find as many electrical savings as possible to pay for the decarbonization. So as Stephanie alluded earlier, good decarb is carbon reductions with the deep energy retrofit. The deep energy retrofit is what's paying for the carbon reduction. So it's really important that you pair both together. Otherwise, the financials and the green lit from the investors is never going to come. Let's go for the next slide.
Okay, so I'll talk briefly about really high level, and there is a case study on the website. I have links. There's lots more information about this, but I'm not going to get into the technical too much. I just want to discuss that, to identify what the best decarbonization bundle was, we looked at lots of different pieces. So we're looking at the building holistically. We looked at a couple options with mechanical systems. Are we going to use the existing terminal units? Are we going to replace them all with terminal heat pumps, which is like really efficient? Are we going to look at variable refrigerant? So, that would be gutting the whole thing, taking out the heating loops, the hot hydronic system, putting in refrigerant. And obviously, this is like the most efficient, but it's also the most expensive. So here you can see we're looking at this net present value per ton. What is the cost? It's negative because it's cost. It's not, you're not getting money. The cost per ton of savings. So you can see that this option was the least cost per ton of savings. There's also other reasons why this was selected. It's the least invasive to occupants. There's, other reasons why we looked at this, but this is what we selected. And this includes, includes controls, it includes sequences, it includes all of those pieces that make the building holistically less wasteful, more efficient, more comfortable, that kind of thing. And you can see we always consider the envelope. We're looking at the building holistically, we're analyzing all the opportunities, and then we're saying, okay, which makes the most sense? And in Vancouver, oftentimes, because of the mild climate, like Kit said, unless there's holes in the envelope that are causing drafts, or the windows no longer open, or there are huge issues with it. Unless there's issues like that, typically we aren't looking at the building envelope retrofit because it's just like the payback is so much worse than some of these other measures. So you can see we did look at it, but we decided against it. And just another quick high level slide here on what was selected. So actually, before we even started this, the domestic hot water system has been converted to a CO2 heat pump. So that's been running now for a few years. And then the zero carbon plan starts with, building automation system. We're switching the system to variable air volume instead of constant volume. We're converting the induction units now. Instead of just cooling, they're heating and cooling. So they're, more surface area. We can have lower temperatures. We're looking at a heat recovery chiller and an air source heat pump, and then we're going to use an electric boiler for the remaining load. But the electric boiler is very, very small because it's going to cover only the tiny bit of remaining load that the other systems can't handle.
So I would just
go back
to that previous slide. The one thing that's not on there is increased electrical capacity. So that is why we've said deep energy retrofit, and my colleague hates the term because it sounds like just jargon. Like, what does that actually mean? You're trying to draw down your electrical use as much as possible so you can take your heating load onto the electricity side. if you're running a really efficient building, you've done all the LEDs, you've got good sensors, you've got good controls on your fans and motors and pumps, you likely created the space in your electrical capacity feed to electrify your building. But if you haven't done that, then you're going to be looking at hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars of electrical upgrades for the building just to be able to do the decarb. And that's why we say it's so important to reduce as much as you can before you look at fuel switching, because you're likely going to be able to cut out that electrical capacity increases. And on the KingSett side, we haven't had to add net new electrical capacity to any of the properties we've decarbonized so far. In the pipeline of 3.5 million square feet of properties we're going to be decarbonizing in the next 3 years, we don't have new or additional electrical feeds being brought into the buildings. So the efficiency game is in full swing with decarb as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat about this, like we call it a low carbon roadmap. I'm going to reply to as many of them as I can, and not to kind of tout this too much, but the commercial electrification guide, which is coming out in October-ish, early October, it talks all about this. Like, we walk you through a low carbon roadmap, why you start with building automation system upgrades, what the benefits are. Like Kit said, we're reducing waste so that we can reduce the heating required, so that we can implement a system that uses lower temperature water. We're reducing electrical waste, so we don't have to do a service upgrade, all of that. And it's a free guide. It'll be available to everyone. We will have a presentation on that shortly. I believe it's in later September or early October when that rolls out. So all of the details will be there, but I'm going to reply to as many of the chats as possible. Okay, so this is where we are right now. So we completed the zero carbon plan. We basically said, how do we get Arthur Erickson Place to net zero carbon in the most efficient, most cost-effective way? Then we got it zero carbon building certified by CAGBC. So this is a cool one. Basically, what it means is that Arthur Erickson Place has committed to being zero carbon in 3 years. And in the interim, they are going to use carbon offsets to make sure that they are net zero operations. Then we got it Investor Ready Energy Efficiency Certified, IREE. And this is one of those pieces that if you have it, it's going to make capital investors much more excited about your project. And there are some capital investment lending firms that do require this certification to actually lend you money at the preferred rates. So we'll talk about that briefly. Then we got some external funding because we had IREE. We did our domestic hot water electrification. It's fully electrified. We've done year one. So all the measures that were in year one are now completed, and we are currently in the design of year two. Oops. Kit, anything to add there?
No, that's good. Yeah.
Perfect.
So finally, because we've started to get a few projects executed, we're getting a lot of lessons learned. I think that are very good to share. We came in very conservative on where we thought decarbonization would put our buildings. We were seeing that if we could get within 5% of net op costs, so that's op costs that take into account utilities, carbon tax, carbon offsets if you're going to be certifying the building, and the amortization of all the equipment you're putting in for the decarbonization. If you could get within 5% of a business as usual op cost, then that's a win. Essentially, what you've done is you've flatlined your operating expenses, but you've significantly de-risked your asset from a physical and transition climate perspective. You've also made it more enticing to prospective tenants, and you've reduced its electrical load, so the grid and the community around it is better off because you're not going to be consuming net more. In fact, in a lot of our cases, we're consuming a significant amount less than what it was pre-decarbonization. Now we're seeing that we actually see improvements of up to 35% reductions on a total energy basis, which is a massive achievement. That's how we get op cost paying for the decarbonization. Water savings can be massive. So the 80% savings we saw at 100 Young, slightly skewed to the high side when it's normalized for the variance in occupancy, because there weren't as many people in now as there was pre-COVID. It's at about 60%, but that's what happens when you take away your cooling towers. You have essentially a closed water system that isn't losing significant amounts to the atmosphere. And in office buildings, that's the vast majority of where your water use is going, it turns out. Always expect overruns. What I like to say is that theoretically, decarbonization is the same across any building, but when you go to actually implement it, every building is a snowflake. The types of infrastructure that exists in one building are going to be different from another, whether you have asbestos that needs to have abatement, whether you can find, good tracks through the infrastructure to run new water risers if you have to do that, whether you don't have any tracks and you need to go into every single tenant space and rip out their perimeter unit heating and cooling systems. That all has a massive knock-on impact to your decarbonization strategy. So don't think that it's just the equipment itself. You're going to run into these other knock-on aspects. These are massive repositioning projects for buildings. They are not easy. So don't think there's nothing that is turnkey about these anymore, or right now. And if anyone is offering that, I would take it with a massive grain of salt until, they've gone and done the full study and you've got, a grade A costing analysis and everything is kind of like signed and stamped by engineers. The tenant attractions we've seen come a bunch. We've seen it either for prospective tenants, understanding that we are committed to decarbonizing and willing to take space in the buildings because that building is on a path to decarbonization, or having it been decarbonized, saying because that is a zero carbon building now, we want to be in that building.
That's it. That's all we've got. I know there's been lots of questions in the chat. I'm trying to respond to some of them, but I think we have a couple. Are we just going through the questions in the chat, or Natalie, do you have some questions?
Jennifer's going to take the first question, then I'll take a stab at the first two questions in the chat. Over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Natalie. Kit, I'm just curious about your experience with your ownership partners. As we know, not every owner is as far along in their organizational decarb strategy as KingSett. Was there enthusiasm upon completion and perhaps a desire to investigate further opportunities, other properties? And then I also have a little follow-up to that. I'm just curious about that 35% operational savings. And were you able to shift some of that to increase rental rates at renewal?
Right. So I'll tackle that first question. Right now with ownership structures, joint venture partners, whether it's at the asset or the fund level, ultimately you need everyone to sign off and be on board with this. And that means whether you want to move really quickly or not, you have to be willing to tell a very good story and show your work to the other owners, so that they can get comfortable with it. Like I said, this is very different from how assets have been renewed in history. You don't really come at this spending all of your capital all at once for all systems at once. So you need to first kind of explain why you want to do it that way, why you think decarbonization's the right thing to do for this asset, and then how you're going to balance out that increased capital cost with either cost savings or where that capital is going to come from, what other kind of methods or scrutiny you're going to apply to this project so that they can get comfortable saying, if I'm going to spend all of this money, I need guarantees that this is what's going to actually happen. And there's not enough data in the market to say, oh, well, it's an LED, it's a lighting retrofit. You'll get your money back in 2 years. We're not there yet. So there's a lot more hand-holding you have to do. That being said, there's a massive appetite from the investor ownership side to see these projects done. They just need to make sense. So you need to lead with the financials and you need to show that you kind of turned over every rock and looked at it. You would analyze this from a lot of different angles, but also show them, if we didn't do this, here's what we would have to do. And one thing we didn't talk about was the Vancouver, sorry, Stephanie mentioned it, the $350 per ton charge that's coming in 2026. Arthur Erickson Place doesn't have that affecting it until 2040, until the allotment for emissions from heating is zero. When that happens, that property is going to avoid anywhere from $600,000 to $1 million in additional fines for the remainder of the life of the equipment we're putting in now. So the decisions we're doing now have this massive knock-on cost avoidance down the road. Now, we don't put that in the model, but we do speak to it anecdotally because all sorts of things could change between now and 2040, but it's another valuable perspective to say, look, this is the right thing to do, because if we don't do it now and we do the wrong thing now, in the future, this could come to hurt us even more, even though we think it's the right thing financially. That second question was the 35% reduction. For office and retail, you kind of have to wait until leases renew or you bringing in a new tenant in order to roll those op cost savings into base rents. Right now, the tenants with existing rents at the buildings that are decarbonized get to pay lower for their utilities. That's great, but over time, when the leases renew, those savings will get transferred into base rents. The tenant will be paying whatever the new electricity bills are, which are going to be lower than what they used to be. But that's the way for the owner or the investor to recapture the effort, the risk, and the additional money being spent to decarbonize. So there is, unfortunately, a bit of a lag in those assets. In multi-res, where there's no ability to recover, those can typically hit the bottom line right away.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions in the chat. We will do our best, Jennifer and I, to get through some of them. First of all, one of the first questions was from Diana asking about what you meant, Kit, by canvas portfolio. I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that's on the KingSett strategy to get to yes. I think it's that you were just canvassing, looking through your portfolio of buildings and trying to decide which one is going to give you that easiest win to get the exact buy-in. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that was the easy win, and then you're looking, and then once you get the buy-in and your ownership, your clients say, okay, tell me where I need to focus for the rest of the portfolio. It's kind of the same process. You're trying to figure out where's the priority, where's the fires, because those are the ones that are going to have all of the metrics and everything line up to make it the easiest win. It unfortunately isn't where is the carbon emissions the most. If that were the case, we'd all be decarbonizing in Saskatchewan and the East Coast and Alberta. Those are actually the most difficult markets to do this in.
Great, thank you, Kit. And one other question, I think you already touched on this at a high level, but from Michaela, if you haven't seen a green premium, have you observed a brown discount?
I don't think yet. I think the brown discount will develop over time. And the green premium is actually going to be higher occupancy. We've already seen buildings capture green premiums for LEED certifications, BOMA BEST certifications, and there's been a lot of really good scientific literature released about what those premiums look like, normalizing for a lot of external factors, and they've kind of put that into the 4 to 8% premium range. Does being decarbonized give you a boost on top of that? Have you already captured all of the green premium in the market that you're going to get? We don't know. It's still early days in the market to kind of understand this. When we see more assets, more spaces turning, more tenants going one place to another, then we'll start to get a better idea, but we just don't have enough of market data yet to really have a clear understanding.
And I think this is really interesting because, I mean, we teach courses on this, so we've read probably like 30 white papers on, you know, what the green premiums are in places that have been doing this for longer, like Australia and Europe. And depending on what document you read, you'll get extremely different answers. And I know several organizations who are trying to figure out what this is. So I think KingSett has an interesting perspective to just be like, you know what, it's gonna be an extra bonus. We're not gonna invest a bunch of time trying to figure that out. So I think that's interesting.
So actually, Stephanie, as you mentioned that, if you go to the graph, this graph has the modeling with carbon tax in it, you know, grossing up to 170 by 2030 and keeping that steady beyond. We aren't confident that pricing is going to stay there forever. So we model with and without any price on carbon tax, any price on carbon. And our feeling now is that these projects, because we're going so deep, we're touching so many systems and we're driving efficiency so far, these projects stand on their own 2 feet, regardless of any pricing on carbon. And for this example in particular, we have $3.09 for the business as usual non-zero carbon strategy and $2.82 for the zero carbon strategy. When we remove carbon tax at 2035, those numbers go to $2.96 and $2.82. So the zero carbon strategy sees no change. Makes sense. It's got almost no emissions, and the tax on those emissions is going to be very small. But the field narrowed. Now we lost a bunch of the kind of savings opportunity, but it still puts the zero carbon strategy cheaper than the non-zero carbon strategy by 10 to 15 cents per square foot. When we were trying to get op costs into, you know, 5% of building business as usual, well, now we created savings. That's massive. That means that regardless of any pricing, we would do this for our buildings no matter what, because it's just better building management.
I'm noticing we're getting close to the end, so I just wanted to let everyone know that on the last page, there's some more information on potential places to seek financing, whether that's incentives or low interest loans, as well as more information on Arthur Erickson Place, just in case we run out of time.
Read my mind, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Again, just a reminder to everyone that these slides and the recording of this video and in podcast form is going to be uploaded afterwards. So don't stress about taking all the right notes.
One final plug here, just because we're on more information. The graph I showed you, that comes from our building decarbonization modeling tool. We made that publicly available to everyone for free. So if you go and download the modeling tool that we created, that's the exact same tool that I use when I'm running our analysis for our executive team, for our investors, in order to get to yes, to do a strategy. We felt it was valuable from our perspective because we didn't find anything in the market that would do what we needed to do in order to get approval. So we built it. We thought others might have the exact same struggle, or if this could even help them 5% on understanding decarb or modeling or getting to yes, then it was worthwhile. So it's out there in the public. A new version's coming out imminently. I was hoping it would be out for today, but it's not. So hopefully by the end of the month.
Thanks so much, Kit and Stephanie and Jennifer, for all of your thoughts. And this has been really great to hear from all your experience. I know we could talk for a very long time on this topic. And as Stephanie said, there is going to be a Decarb Lunch probably in November on the topic of SES's electrification guide, co-hosted with B2E. And so definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. I wanted to make a little shout out for another Decarb Lunch happening next week on Wednesday. We're busy these days. We got 2 a month now. There's just so much to talk about. So yeah, sign up for this if you're interested. Part 9 retrofit, a deep retrofit in West Vancouver, a really inspiring project there, looking also at aging in place. The next thing I want to highlight is just if you're interested in embodied carbon, Kit even mentioned in his presentation really briefly, but if you want to be around a lot of embodied carbon nerds and just be enthused about the topic, I highly recommend you check out this event. We sell out normally CLFBC events very quickly, so I would recommend that you get your ticket very soon. And that is happening mid-October. So make sure to get your ticket very soon. And then finally, as a last statement, just to thank everyone on the call for attending. This exchange is only as good as those who participate in it. Stephanie, Kit, Jennifer, all contributing their time to share what they've learned with all you folks. And thank you all for engaging in the chat. We really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.